Let's look at the case where we have multi-dimensional input and multi-dimensional output. Here is such an example. This was a project which a PhD student had a few years ago. The idea was to extract sugars from an apple pomace mixture by adding an enzyme and putting it into a bioreactor. Reaction took place and sugars were produced as output. And the idea was to try and optimize the input conditions so that maximum sugar was released. This is a summary of the process. The conditions were the substrate concentration, that's the apple pomace, the temperature in the bioreactor, the pH, and the enzyme concentration. This was then put into the bioreactor, and the reaction took place, and the output was what we can call a release profile. The SI here is the concentration or the percentage of sugar released at time I. So initially, no sugar is released, so this S0 is 0. And the release profile is then a vector, an 11-dimensional vector, and the input conditions were 4-dimensional vectors. This is the spreadsheet which recorded the experimental data. In the actual experiment, there wasn't just one temperature, but there was a lower temperature and upper temperature, a lower pH and an upper pH, the enzyme concentration and the substrate concentration. So we had 6-dimensional input. So those are the conditions now, a vector in R6. And the release profile had these 6 components. Of course, at time 0, there was 0 release, so there's no need to have that there. And that means that the output vector was 6-dimensional in this particular case. So there's the input vector, and there's the output vector, the release profile. Now, there's some relationship between the input vectors, the 6-dimensional input vectors, and the 6-dimensional output vectors. And you could, as I said before, you could try and model this in various ways, but this is just crying out for a neural network to try and discover the relationship between the input and output. It will approximate this process. So with that last reaction that we looked at in mind, could we propose a regression function? We've got an unknown association between 6-dimensional vectors and input and 6-dimensional vectors as output. How can we propose a regression function? We could try and find a linear approximation to the process. In other words, we could look for a matrix W so that W times the input vectors is approximated to output vectors. We could solve for W using the backslash operator. But in general, if you've got an association between Rn and Rm, and this represents a chemical process, then it's unlikely to be modeled by a linear relationship. Be much more useful to find another relationship which approximates the process. So finding a regression function, a non-linear regression function, is going to be just about impossible. What we will do is find neural networks which will approximate non-linear processes. So the idea was born in the 1950s to try and get a computational system which mimicked the way the brain works. Now, our human brains are extremely good at pattern recognition. You look at those photos there, immediately, even though the configurations are different, you recognize that this is Donald Trump, and you immediately recognize that this is a young girl. Now, facial recognition is a very important field of endeavor, but we're not going to concentrate on that. the sort of pattern recognition that we're going to be involved in comes from information of this form. This is a comma-separated file, and the first number here is just an identity of a person. Each one is the identity of a person who's undergone a biopsy, trying to determine then whether they have breast cancer or not. And so the input is these variables here, these features. These are numbers which describe various features of the biopsy. And the diagnosis is here. The 2 represents a benign tumor, that's the diagnosis, whereas a 4, a malignant tumor. And it's very important to be able to perform this form of pattern recognition. And we will make a neural network in the near future which will be able to identify, to classify a tumor as being benign or malignant from the features that are given to it. Here is an image of the human brain showing the neural connections within the brain. Here's a close-up of that, and these are the individual neurons. These are biological neurons. Each neuron is connected to about 10,000 others, and there's about 10 to the power 10 billion neurons in total. So the human brain is a massively connected computational system consisting of units, each of which is a neuron, a biological neuron. And they receive input from the neurons connected to them, and they give out output in the form of electromagnetic impulses. Here's a schematic diagram of such a system, and here the little dots represent neurons and the lines represent the connections between those neurons. The idea then was to construct an artificial network of neurons. The neurons would not be, of course, biological. They would be mathematical functions, and there would be connections between the artificial neurons. These neurons will actually just be mathematical functions, which we'll talk about just now, and the connections between them will be governed by matrices. The matrix will contain weights which control the input from one neuron to another. So an artificial neural network will consist of artificial neurons, will be mathematical functions, and matrices which describe the interconnections between the layers. Here's a diagram of a biological neuron. Your brain consists of about 10 billion of these, and they receive input in the form of electrochemical impulse into the neuron, and it pulses out to the neurons to which it is connected. Here is a schematic diagram of such a neuron. It's going to receive inputs into a cell body and then produce outputs. We are going to replace neurons by mathematical functions, which we're going to call transfer functions. And I'll show you some examples of such functions. Here's the first one, the hard limit function, or the physicists would call this the unit step function. X here is the input, and A is the activation. And from the graph you can see that the activation is 0 until it hits X equal to 0, at which stage there's a sudden jump up to 1. From then on, the activation is 1. So it's described mathematically over here, the unit step function or the hard limit function. This is a modification of the hard limit function where Instead of the unit step occurring at 0, it occurs at some threshold, which we're going to call theta. There we are. Then the input is 0 until it reaches this threshold. Then there's a sudden jump of 1. So that is now a modification of the hard limit function. Here is a schematic diagram of an artificial neuron. The neuron is here. It contains a mathematical function. It receives an input into the neuron, which we're going to call n. N is obtained by taking an input pattern P and multiplying by some modification factor W. So WP, and then there's going to be an added B, which we call a bias. So the input into the neuron is WP plus B. The transfer function is going to apply, and it will produce an activation A. That function, whatever it happens to be, and we'll look at some more examples just now, the function applies to the input into the neuron, N. N is WP plus B. Here, this could be a single number, and then B would be a number, but in general, this is going to be a vector. B will be a vector, W will be a matrix, and the input N is going to be a vector. Function is going to apply to the vector and produce a vector output. Here is a transfer function that we're going to be using a lot called the purelin. Very simply, A is just N, and a modification of that, the saturated linear function, for which A is just N up to a certain point. From then on, it saturates, and the value is just 1. This is a modification of that. It's the symmetric saturated linear function. So it's linear in a certain domain, and it saturates beyond a level, and it's saturated before a level. We looked at the hard limit function, which just was 0 and then activated to a 1 at 0 or at some threshold. This is the symmetric hard limit function, which is -1 up to the crucial point, and then it jumps up to 1. These two transfer functions, the log-zig and the tan-zig function, are the ones which we are going to be using a lot. The log sigmoid is defined like this, and you should sketch this graph, but it has the feature that it is S-shaped. And similarly, this is just a hyperbolic tangent. Those hyperbolic trigonometric functions, this is a hyperbolic tangent. Or in the context of neural networks, we call it tan-zig. And you should sketch this, but when you sketch it, you should note it also has this sigmoidal shape, like an elongated S. Try and sketch those functions now. Alright, if you successfully sketch that, the log-zig function looks like this, hence the name of sigmoidal. It looks something like a stretched out S, and notice that its lower limit is 0 and its upper limit is 1. So that's log-zig. And the tan-zig function, the hyperbolic tangent, similar sort of shape, except that now the limits are between -1 and +1. Let's look at the situation where we have multi-dimensional input, in which case we've got a vector of inputs, P1 to PR. Each PI is modified by an amount WI, and the input N into this artificial neuron, which is just a function, is obtained by taking the modifications of all of these PIs. So we're going to take as input the sum of all the WI PIs, run that over from 1 to R, then this additive amount B, which we call a bias. We're using W's here because we're thinking of these as weights. They are the mathematical equivalent of those neurotransmitters which modify the input into the biological neuron. So we're taking the sum of all these WI PIs and then this additive amount. That is the input N into the neuron, which is just a function, one of those ones that we've discussed. and the output will be an activation A. So that's the notation that we'll be using. And when you see a sum like this, you can write that as a matrix product. The sum of all the WIPIs, that's a dot product, which can be written as a row vector times a column vector, or a row matrix, or 1 by R matrix, and an R by 1 matrix P. So we can write that succinctly as W times P plus the B. And W times P is just a single number. W is a 1 by R vector. P is a R by 1 vector. Their product is a number, 1 by 1. Add the number B. The star here represents matrix product, and we're going to suppress that from now on. So when we write WP, we mean W times P, matrix product. So that is the input into this artificial neuron, which is a function. That's going to apply to N to give us an activation A. So A is the function, the transfer function on N. N is obtained by this matrix product WP, then the additive amount B. If we have a layer of neurons, so now say we've got S neurons here, we focus on the ith neuron, and we treat it just as we did before for a single neuron. We'll let Ni be the input into neuron I. Let Wij be the weighting into neuron I from pattern J. So Wij from J into I. Then the input into the ith neuron is just as the same as the expression we had before, except that now we've got Ni. This is the ith neuron. So it's I fixed and J is running, Wij Pj. Just like we did before, except that now instead of N, we've got Ni. We're focusing on the ith neuron. If we have a layer of S neurons, each with the transfer function F in it, then we get the input into the ith neuron by just concentrating what's happening here in the ith neuron. If Ni denotes that input into the ith neuron, then again it's a WP plus B, but the W here is the ith row of a matrix. And P is this vector whose components are the PIs, and the BI is the ith component of the vector B. That's the bias going into the ith neuron. That means that the input into this layer of neurons is a vector N1 to NS. So we write that as a single vector N, and the bias is a single vector B whose components are B1 to BS. Then the input into that layer is represented as a vector N, the matrix W times vector P plus vector B. The activation then comes out of each of these neurons. Out of the ith neuron comes AI, and A is the vector whose ith component is AI. So the activation A is written as F applied to WP plus B, F applied to N. This is the way in which we represent that. There's our input pattern, a vector P with components P1 to PR. That's the R by 1 column vector going in, received by a matrix W, size S by R. R dimensional vector coming in, S dimensional vector coming out. So the weight matrix is S by R. It's combined with this bias vector to give you WP plus B. That's what N is. That's the vector of inputs into that layer. The transfer function applies, and the activation vector is S by 1. Let's focus our attention on what's happening in the typical kth layer of a neural network. The input into the kth layer is the activation out of the previous layer, k-1, and we're using superscripts here. A superscript k-1 is the vector which is coming out of layer k-1. WK, and we're using again a superscript to denote this, is the weight matrix in layer K. WK and the activation WK times AK minus 1 plus this bias BK is going to give us the input into this layer of neurons. Each neuron has function FK, so it could be tanzig or logzig, one of those transfer functions, and A superscript K is going to be the activation out of layer K. This is the situation, then layer K minus 1 here, there's layer K, and layer K receives activations out of layer K minus 1. It then processes it. It takes the weight matrix times AK minus 1 plus that vector of biases in the kth layer, and that's the input into that layer of neurons in layer K. Then it activates out via the kth transfer functions. So don't forget it's the same transfer function in each of the neurons here. If that's an input pattern P, then in layer 1 we've got W1 and B1, and it activates out to give us A superscript 1. Into layer 2, there's W2 and B2, that's the weight matrix, and that's that vector of biases in layer 2, activates out, and so on up the line. Out of layer N minus 1, there's activation AN minus 1, and that's into layer N. So that is a schematic representation of a whole neural network with N layers. So there's an input layer, goes from layer 1 to layer N minus 1, and there's an output layer. And these layers in between are called hidden layers. Let's cook up a little example. Say this is a situation where you have a neural network which receives three-dimensional input. Let's do this with MATLAB. So P is then a three-dimensional vector, 3 by 1. There are two neurons. So there's, say, the bias. This is the bias in neuron 1. This is the bias that's fed into neuron 2. That means the weight matrix must be a 2 by 3, three-dimensional input, two-dimensional output. So the weight matrix is 2 by 3. So let's make up a weight matrix like that. So there are two rows because there are two neurons. Three-dimensional input, that means there are 3 columns. So it receives this three-dimensional input. So the input into the neuron, N, is WP plus B. W is 2 by 3, P is 3 by 1, then it produces a 2 by 1 output. And that goes into this function. We'll have the tanzig function there, for example. Then the activation is a two-dimensional vector. Here's the general situation. There'll be a process which we'll be investigating, or some scientist will be investigating, and they'll produce data. Like they say with that sugar example we looked at, the input patterns with the conditions for the reaction, and that what we will call the target is the output. That is what happened, and in that case that was the release profile, that vector of concentrations of sugars at various times. So there'll be an input pattern and what we will call a target, vector input, vector output, and we're going to make a neural network which we want to simulate that process. So for a given input pattern, we want the activation to be as close as possible to the target. And that means we're going to try and minimize the sum of squares errors. Each EI will be TI minus AI, the ith components. And that means that this error is going to be a function of all of the components of the weights and the biases within the network. So we are going to adjust the weights and the biases in such a way that the sum of squares of errors goes down. It will be an iterative process in which we adjust the weights and the biases each time in such a way that the sum of squares of errors goes down. The E is a function of many variables, so we try to minimize a function of many variables. Suppose we've got a neural network and we use the terminology that's adopted by MATLAB. They say there are SI neurons in layer I. And the transfer functions in each layer are all the same. And in layer I, let's fi be the transfer function. And we've got an input pattern r by 1, but suppose there are q of them. So that's a whole matrix of input patterns. And each is r dimensional. So this P is going to be R by, the whole set of input patterns would be an R by Q matrix. Here's one of them. And we've got Q of them. So if there are S1 neurons in layer 1, S2 in layer 2, and S3 in layer 3, the weight matrix between the input patterns and these S1 neurons in the first layer is going to be S1 by R. And the weight matrix here will have dimensions S2 by S1, and here S3 by S2. The biases, it'll be a vector of biases. There are S1 neurons, so it'll be an S1 by 1, a column vector containing the biases in this first layer. Similarly, S2 by 1 and S3 by 1. The activation then produced will be A1 coming out of the first layer. So P goes in, you take W1, that first weight matrix, this one, W1 times P plus the bias, function 1 applies, activation A1 comes out of layer 1 into layer 2. W2 receives it, multiplies by A1, adds the bias, activates out of layer 2 into layer 3. So A2 comes into layer 3, and that's the activation out of layer 3. Let's send a batch of input patterns through a neural network with MATLAB. And suppose we've got three-dimensional input, and there are Q being 5 samples. So the input pattern P is going to be a 3 by 5 matrix. Each column is an individual input pattern. Let's specify the number of neurons. So in layer 1, we've got 5 neurons. Layer 2, 3, and layer 3, we've got 1 neuron. That means that the first weight matrix is going to be S1 by R. Okay, 5 by 3. Got a 5 by 3 matrix, which I generate using the random number generator. Remember the syntax for this. It's a matrix which is S1 by R, 5 by 3, and the numbers in the matrix are uniformly distributed in this range between -1 and 1. So this is the size of the matrix, and this is the range for the numbers. So there's our first weight matrix. There's the second then. It's got to be S2 by S1, 3 by 5. And then the last one has got to be S3 by S2. So those are our weight matrices. The biases, well, S1 is 5. So there are 5 neurons in the first layer. So the biases must be a 5 by 1 vector. There are 3 neurons in layer 2. So B2 has got to be 3 by 1. There's 1 neuron in layer 3. The B3 vector is just a scalar, a 1 by 1. Let's sort out the transfer function. So the Tanzig function is in all the neurons in layer 1, logzig in all the neurons in layer 2, and pure ln in the neuron in layer 3. There's our input patterns then. I've just generated it. I've used the function which generates integers. They are between 0 and 9, and they are R by Q. That's 3 by 5. So that's now a batch of input patterns. Each column is an input pattern. What's N1 then? This is what gets fed into the first layer of neurons. It's W1P plus B1. There's N1, and then we apply the function to it, F1, applied to this whole N1 now. MATLAB then just applies that function to all of these components, and there's the activation out of the first layer. N2 gets fed into the neurons in layer 2, And we apply that function, F2, to that input to get the activation A2 out of layer 2. That gets fed into layer 3. This is the input into the neurons in layer 3. There's just one of them. So there's N3. And it's a scalar, but remember there were Q of them. And Q here was 5. So those are the inputs, and then the activation of this third, which is the Purelin function on these inputs, gives you the activation out of that third layer. The general process that we'll be investigating is a situation where we've got input patterns and targets obtained from some experimental process or from a set of data. And there's some unknown association, there's some unknown function which relates the inputs and the outputs, the input patterns and the targets. We're going to make a neural network which is meant to simulate this process. It's meant to approximate it. We're going to feed it these input patterns and it will activate. And we want the error between the activation and the targets to be as small as possible. That means if we form the sum of the squares of the errors, each EI is TI minus AI, then we want the sum of the squares of the errors to be minimized. The method of achieving that minimization of the error is the backpropagation algorithm. We will discuss this in great detail just now. In general, there's an input pattern which will be fed into the neural network, produces an activation, and we'll compare that with the target vector, and then we'll get an error vector, and from that the sum of the squares of the errors. The algorithm feeds this error back in a very clever way. It is used to adjust the weights and the biases in this neural network in such a way that the neurons which are causing the greatest error are adjusted the most. So it's the weight matrices and the biases which are adjusted, but not just randomly or uniformly. They're done in a pro-rata fashion. And the engine behind the whole thing is gradient descent. And that process, that iterative process of taking the error and feeding it back into the neural network, adjusting the weights in a pro-rata fashion, is called training the neural network. The gradient descent process, which we'll talk about in some detail, is how it learns. So this is the learning mechanism, and this iterative process of feeding it back and adjusting the weights and the biases is called training. So we're going to develop a learning technique, and we're going to use that in a loop, an iterative process, to adjust the weights and the biases so that the error goes down. Just so that we can visualize this, can you imagine that we've got just two variables here? In general, the number of variables is going to be the number of components and all the weights and the biases in this neural network. But just so that we can see it, supposing that error is a function of just two variables, like this here. That's an error surface. So the error is a function of these two variables. What we want to do is start at some point and work our way down this surface, and this will be a multi-dimensional surface. We're going to weave our way down the surface looking for a global minimum. Just imagine you are standing on that surface at a point x1 and you want to get down towards a global minimum. You search around and you take a step in the direction of the steepest gradient downwards. Now you're at a new point. You search around for the direction which takes you down as fast as possible, the steepest gradient downwards. You're at a new point, and you repeat this process. Hopefully this will lead you towards the global minimum. Here's an exercise for you to test your skills on. Just prove these little results about these transfer functions. It's just to enable you to get used to them. These are very important, that you must obtain expressions for the derivatives of these sigmoidal transfer functions. They're also called squashing functions. We will encounter this many times in the SQL. So that these are important exercises. Some more for you to try, and then try and redo what I did back in the examples there. Just write a little script which does this. So it just sends input patterns through a network which you construct by hand. So you construct the weight matrices and the biases, give yourself an input pattern matrix, a matrix of input patterns, get the inputs into the neurons and the activations out of the various layers.